The Juan Soto sweepstakes are starting to take shape, and another city has thrown its hat in the ring for a WNBA team. We also have stories from the NFL, NHL, MLS, and college football. It's Thursday, November 21st. I'm your host, Owen Poindexter, and this is Front Office Sports Today. In today's episode, we're chatting with my colleague Eric Fisher on the state of the Juan Soto talks, how many hundreds of millions he might get, and what it says about MLB right now. Later, reporter Colin Salao takes a look at the WNBA's expansion plans. Plus, two very successful coaches were shown the door, MLB is putting together a national media package, and prize money in women's golf is hitting record levels. Here are your top headlines. The number one ranked Oregon Ducks have secured a spot in the Big Ten Championship in their inaugural season with the conference. The Big Ten confirmed that in all 10 of their incredibly complicated tiebreaker scenarios, the 11-0 Ducks are guaranteed to finish the season in either first or second place in the conference. The second spot in the championship game will fall to either Penn State, Ohio State, or the surprisingly undefeated Indiana Hoosiers. Who gets that second spot will become a lot more clear after Indiana and Ohio State face off this weekend. The WNBA is looking to expand to 16 teams by 2028, and Cleveland has officially launched their bid to host one of the W's new teams. Cavs CEO Nick Bartlett said, "We are actively pursuing bringing a WNBA expansion team to Cleveland." The city makes a lot of sense as an expansion site as it already holds an NBA-sized arena in Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, and it's hosted the WNBA team in the past with the Cleveland Rockers from 1997 to 2003. Good name, by the way. The WNBA has already found the sites for its 13th, 14th, and 15th teams in San Francisco, Portland, and Toronto, but Cleveland faces a lot of competition for that last expansion spot. Patrick Mahomes has publicly supported bringing the WNBA to Kansas City, and Philadelphia, Miami, St. Louis, and Denver have all been named as potential expansion cities. More on this later with our reporter Colin Salao. The Philadelphia Flyers followed MLB's lead by adding a sponsor logo to their helmets. They announced a deal with Chevrolet, and the Chevy logo made its debut on Flyers helmets in last night's game against the Carolina Hurricanes. The new deal went beyond the helmets. The Flyers announced that any fan who drove to last night's game in a Chevrolet was allowed to park for free. Sunday afternoon's Bills-Chiefs game drew in a whopping 31.1 million viewers for CBS, the largest audience of the 2024 season and the largest regular season non-holiday audience since 2007, when an undefeated Tom Brady and Peyton Manning faced off against each other. The game featured two of the biggest stars in the league between Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, and the league itself was touting the showdown as the potential game of the year. The Chiefs are now responsible for the three most watched games of the season and are further separating themselves from quote-unquote America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. MLB wants to create a national package of local broadcast rights, and it looks like it will be able to do so with around two-thirds of the teams, but it'll have to wait until 2028. The league has insisted that contracts with Diamond Sports Group end by that year or sooner, and it already produces games from 7 other teams. Doing that will allow the league to finally eliminate local blackouts on streaming services for most of the league, but it creates a slew of new questions, namely how many teams will be in the group, how will MLB divide up the rights into packages, and how is the revenue going to be distributed? With a new CBA also on the horizon, the business of baseball could be radically different a few years from now. All of that could shift which teams are interested in top-end free agents such as Juan Soto. My colleague Eric Fisher has been keeping his finger on the pulse of the Soto talks and how the rest of life behind the scenes at MLB is impacting them, and he joins us next. I'm joined now by Front Office Sports newsletter writer Eric Fisher. Welcome, Eric.
Hello.
So great to have you on. So the Juan Soto sweepstakes are starting to take shape. It's still early days, of course, but he's been meeting with teams. What would you say about the approach that he and his agent Scott Boras have been taking to this, potentially record-breaking free agency?
Very personal, very hands-on. There's been a lot by the teams. There's been a lot of individual team meetings up to and including ownership. We've had Hal Steinbrenner with the Yankees, Steve Cohen with the Mets, people of that ilk going out to California to meet with Juan Soto and Scott Boras and make their pitch. And you've had flavors of this with other big free agents in the past, and certainly Shohei Ohtani last year as well. But this kind of high-level pitch meeting thing, detailed sessions with each team really laying out their vision of why Juan should sign there. Very, very interesting, and obviously something of this economic magnitude, up to and including the highest levels of ownership.
Yeah, and I feel like the involved owner was something like we saw, it was just like very normal in the not the early days, but like the 80s, 90s, that was just kind of how things operated. And then there was a movement toward like getting the owner out of the way as much as you can and like letting the people who really know how the modern game works run the show. But for something like this, this is gonna be like over $500 million. Like
Right.
the owner has to, on some level, be there, and also be there to like show that you're not just getting a huge pile of cash. You are getting a franchise that is gonna put a winning team around him, because you can't just drop Juan Soto on every single team and turn that team into a winner. We saw that with A-Rod. We've seen it with Mike Trout.
Yeah, and that latter consideration is really important because the money is going to be roughly equal, and money may ultimately determine to be it may become a somewhat of a determining factor, a difference between one team's bid and another. But in this early stage, the money is roughly equal in terms of what some of these initial outreaches have been reported to be. So it's really important, particularly at this initial conversational stage, to get a sense of where each team is at in terms of their long-range strategy. What is that owner going to be putting in terms year after year in terms of putting forth a contending team? Because again, the money's going to be somewhat equal across all of the major bidders, and it's been made clear by Scott Boras and Juan himself that having a consistent opportunity to win is really important.
Yeah, and do we know anything more about the money? Like, is any like range or anything that we can point to, or are we still just guessing at this point?
A little bit. There's been some suggestions that the Mets are prepared to go beyond 650 million in terms of a total package, and maybe even beyond if there's other rival bidders in that same sort of range. When this thing all started, the expectation was, Juan Soto's probably going to be over 600 million in terms of a package. I think what we can say at this point, now that we are a couple of weeks into the off season, is that 600 million is definitely going to be broken, and it's just a matter now of how close he gets to Ohtani.
Yeah, and I just feel like if it does end up being the Mets, it's just going to be like a silly number. Like with Otani, we knew it was going to be crazy, but like no one was saying 700 million, and obviously it's not 700 million depending on how you look at the deferrals. But I feel like Steve Cohen is ready to just like go full Steve Cohen here. And, not to say he's going to get him, but I think either it's going to be someone like the Red Sox, the Yankees, the Phillies, maybe the Blue Jays at like 600s and change, or the Mets at like 701 or like 650 or something like that.
Yeah, and there's really kind of a battle for the soul of New York to a certain extent that's at play here. And it may sound a little hyperbolic, but one of the really interesting things about the 2024 Mets is, yes, they lost to the Dodgers in the LCS, but they were so much fun. There were good vibes around this team, and you had the OMG thing, and you had the Grimace thing, and there was just so much joy around this team. And for a franchise that's been surrounded with so much defeatism and fatalism over the years, that was such a transitional moment for them. And I think we're in, particularly as long as Lindor is on this team and he's locked into a long-term contract there, because he's been such a linchpin in that sort of reborn joy with this franchise. There's a completely different vibe around this Mets team. And if you add Soto on top of that, sort of the traditional pecking order of the Yankees dominating the New York market and the Mets being the little brother or, the younger sibling, that dynamic, I think, fundamentally changes.
Yeah, I mean, like Soto's the sort of player that like the Yankees they would keep him like in previous generations. Like there's no way he's going anywhere else. Like he would talk to other teams to get the bidding up a little bit, but there were times when the Yankees wanted a guy, they'd get their guy, and like clearly they want this guy.
Historically, the Yankees were so far out and ahead of the rest of the league economically. That's not the case anymore, that the richest owner in the league is Steve Cohen with the Mets. And then you've got the Dodgers. We haven't really talked about them in this conversation, but they're still out there. They're the defending champions. You've got all of that strength and might of Guggenheim and Mark Walter and Stan Kasten and that crew. And they're just they're locked into a long-term, very lucrative TV deal with Spectrum, highest attendance in the league, arguably more of an international profile than any other franchise in the league. And so that Yankees dominance is not what it once was.
Yeah, and it's just crazy to me to think that the Dodgers could follow up an offseason where they got Yamamoto and Otani and, Teoscar Hernandez and other people with an offseason where they get Soto and Roki Sasaki. Like, I'm generally on the side of like, hey, if an owner wants to spend, like, other owners should just try to catch up. But like, this just feels like too much.
Yeah, and the Diamondback, and I'm just looking at that rest of that division. The Diamondbacks are a good team, and the Padres are an even better team, and they were in the playoffs. But if you're like somebody at the bottom end of that division having to play the Dodgers in that divisional rotation, if you're a Colorado Rockies fan and you're looking across the diamond at that stacked team as you just described it, where's the hope there? It's like, it's just crazy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Rockies have been kind of in the doldrums for a long time. And yeah, the Giants keep trying to, I feel like after they crazily won 3 World Series in 5 years, they haven't quite figured out their identity, their groove, and they've tried a couple different things. Now Buster Posey's at the helm there.
Which
But
I think
yeah,
is going to help.
yeah. I think they'll be able to put together a like sort of plucky, like interesting team there, but plucky and interesting might not do much against.
Yeah, and it's still a big shift from a decade ago when I remember writing at the time that the Giants were becoming a model franchise. They had won 3 and 5 seasons, and they were thought leaders on how to engage young fans and how to run a stadium in a modern way and bring in ancillary events. And they still are thought leaders in a lot of respects, but they're now sort of, given that Guggenheim has come in and just taken the Dodgers in this whole other direction, the Giants are very much playing catch up.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. I mean, we've got a CBA coming, new negotiations coming in a couple of years. Does baseball try to respond to the presence of the Mets and the Dodgers as just like these financial juggernauts? In the Mets case, just a billionaire who just wants to spend what it takes to get a Mets World Series. Does MLB try to? I mean, they've already tried with their the Steve Cohen tax and things like that, but it hasn't contained them yet. So are they going to try something else?
Yeah, I think it's less about necessarily the top end in isolation than it is the spread, because one of the other things that we haven't talked about yet in this conversation is that you've got a whole middle and lower class of the league that is seeing their local media revenues completely upended by what's going on in the RSN business, and particularly as it relates to Diamond Sports Group. They're now out of bankruptcy, but you've still got a very different situation in terms of a number of these teams have had revised rights deals, and you still got existential decline in the linear TV business. And meanwhile, you've got these large market teams that either own their own networks or are locked into a very lucrative deal for many, many years at sort of old market rates. And that growing divide between the haves and the have-nots, that's kind of the big thing that the league is really going to have to wrestle with, and it's 2 prongs to that, because they're going to have to come to some sense of agreement internally, and then which is no small feat, and then they're going to have to sell it to the players.
Yeah, and right, and the players are they want the biggest deals they can get, and and so that's not necessarily like having an even playing field between the Royals and the Yankees. That's they want a free spending economy for the most part. Yeah. Should be really interesting to see. Eric Fisher, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Always a pleasure.
One of the biggest winners from the Jake Paul-Mike Tyson fight last weekend was the NFL. The league got to see Netflix stress tested by an unrelated live sports event. With its Christmas doubleheader coming to Netflix, not any of its existing media partners, the league needs to get this right on the first try, and it's likely that would not have happened if Netflix didn't encounter its much-discussed buffering issues for the pretend boxing match. That's no guarantee that Netflix won't encounter all the same problems, but at least they know that there is a problem to solve. Sources told Front Office Sports that the league has inquired with Netflix on its technical infrastructure since the match. One source said that there were clearly a lot of emails and calls flying around over the weekend. What happened was definitely noted, and there were conversations. The NFL has a 3-year deal with Netflix, and neither of them want to answer a bunch of uncomfortable questions the morning after if the buffering wheel becomes the Grinch that stole Christmas. More and more, coaching in sports is about what have you done for me lately, and you won't find a better example of that than Jim Montgomery, who was relieved of his duties by the Boston Bruins on Tuesday. Montgomery guided the Bruins to a league record 135-point season 2 years ago. He finishes his Bruins tenure with a 120, 41, 23 record and a .715 points percentage. Despite that incredible record, the team has had a lackluster start in its first quarter of the season, and Montgomery is now out of a job and has been replaced by assistant coach Joe Sacco on an interim basis. I have no idea if it's the right move or not, but coasting on your record is a thing of the past. There's a potentially similar situation over in MLS, but the details are less clear. Inter Miami head coach Gerardo Tata Martino is stepping down for personal reasons and will address the media on Friday. Martino saw the Lionel Messi-led club to a record-setting regular season this year, as well as the 2023 Leagues Cup trophy and the 2024 Supporters Shield. However, the year ended surprisingly early with Miami falling to Atlanta United, Martino's former team, in the first round of the playoffs. It would be a surprise if Inter Miami was pushing him out the door, but they have a limited window with Messi, and they'll do everything they can to maximize it. Up next, Cleveland wants a WNBA team, and they are not alone in that. My colleague Colin Salao is looking into what the city brings to the table and why they may fit many of the league's criteria for expansion. That conversation is next. I'm joined now by front office sports reporter Colin Salao. Welcome, Colin.
Hey, Owen. Always nice to be here.
Yeah, always great to have you. So Cleveland wants a WNBA team. They are not alone in that desire. We'll get to that shortly. But first of all, what is Cleveland offering here?
Yeah, obviously it's the Rock Entertainment Group, which is the parent company or the umbrella company of Dan Gilbert, who is the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers. So they kind of offer that tie on with already an NBA team, which is, about half the league has the same tie-in, including the Golden State Valkyries, which join next year. So they're offering kind of that, assurance that you're going to have an ownership group that's already familiar with sports, that's already committed to a sports team in the city, and obviously is going to tie in with a practice facility that they already have, which is one of the big things that Kathy Engelbert is really asking for when it comes to looking for these expansion teams. Now, there's just one left, and like you said, there's a lot of suitors. One left as of what they're saying. So there's a lot of suitors there, and it's but at least what we could see is Cleveland has the infrastructure.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, just the WNBA is, has added a couple of teams already. One more slot by, was it 2028? We can talk about whether we believe there's only one more slot, but yeah, you were starting to get into it. What's basically the checklist here of, so you want a WNBA team, yeah, practice facility. What else are we looking for?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's the arena, it's the practice facility, ultimately the player experience. Those are the things that Kathy Engelbert mentioned. She also said long-term ownership group, one that's committed, and then everything else from like the city itself. And I think also, if I'm looking at it from a business standpoint, she didn't necessarily say this, but kind of looking at the overall map of the WNBA, where are there teams that are kind of missing in the map around North America, right? So that's why they added Toronto, which is coming in 2026. Where else can you look for a city? Maybe it's in the Midwest in Ohio, where we have Indiana and Minnesota and Chicago. Do we need another one there? I think that's also one of the options that they should be considering. But overall, I think one of the things I really always harp at is that whole practice facility portion of it, because when I spoke to Natalie Nakase, the incoming head coach of the Golden State Valkyries, she cited that as one of the biggest reasons for why she wanted this role with the Valkyries, because she knows that in the WNBA, that's what recruiting one of the biggest things for recruiting other players. And there's no better example than right now, if anyone who follows and is watching the Phoenix Mercury social media, you'll see that Kalia Copper and Natasha Cloud have been posting about the Phoenix Suns and Mercury practice facility and using that as a way to entice new free agents to come in. So that's clearly one of the big factors right now. And at least something like Cleveland, you're assured that they have a nice practice facility, or an NBA quality practice facility that the WNBA deserves.
Yeah, I mean that has to be one of the biggest gaps in like what players think about versus like what fans are paying attention to and notice and care about. But it makes sense. I mean, if your office was if you worked at two different offices, like every other day or whatever, and one of them was like a big fancy arena, and one of them was just like like a high school gym, basically, that would make a difference.
Look at Chicago right now. I was able to see Chicago's where they're currently practicing, and it's literally just a court in kind of like a public, not a public area, but like a private space. It's just one court, and while you have these billion-dollar or multi-million-dollar facilities for other teams like the Liberty and the Mercury, so it kind of feels like for players like they're getting shortchanged if they go to even a big city like Chicago. And that's another reason why Chicago has decided to build a better practice facility. So it is a big deal, and I think it's something that that they're really looking out for to ensure parity as well for this next expansion team.
Right, and also in a league where the salaries aren't that high for professional athletes, it's one way to differentiate yourself as a team. And so yeah, we've talked about how there's one spot left for now for league expansion. How many cities are we looking at, and who's are really putting themselves out there to get a team?
Yeah, I mean, Kathy Engelbert has said that about 10 to 12 cities are interested. I wouldn't be shocked if there's more, to be quite honest. I mean, you look at how much the cost is right now for an expansion WNBA franchise. The Golden State paid about 50 million for an expansion fee. I believe Portland was somewhere in, or Toronto, maybe one of the two paid about 100+ million, but that included building a practice facility. So there is it's fairly cheap, I guess, relative to owning a sports team in terms of the expansion fee. And if you're looking at the growth of the league, you can say that this is an early investment that you'd want to make, and that's why there are so many cities who want to make it. Right, we have Kansas City, where Patrick Mahomes and Brittany Mahomes want to be a potential investor. St. Louis, where Jason Tatum is from, and he wants to be an investor of that team. The Bucks have already shown interest. Even some teams in South Florida, like Jacksonville, Orlando and Miami, who have had teams in the past. So there are a bunch of cities that have already publicly expressed interest, and now Cleveland is just another one of those.
And I wanted to touch on the NBA partnership angle. A lot of teams, as you mentioned, a lot of WNBA teams have an NBA or are owned by the NBA team in that city, or have a very active partnership. Do you feel like, not necessarily like the WNBA is leaning toward that as its own thing, but that those bids have an advantage just because they probably have really nice facilities. They've got team owners that have shown they are committed to basketball and have built potentially winning teams, especially in the case of the Warriors and the Valkyries. Is this process tilted toward NBA ownership groups?
Yeah, I mean, I would say to a certain extent. I think the big thing is that it's ownership groups that have sports experience, right? So if you look at the expansion teams that we've seen so far, just an example would be you got the Valkyries, who are tied with the Warriors, Joe Lacob and the Warriors. Then you have the Portland's team, which is yet to be named. They are not owned by the Portland Trailblazers, but their ownership group has a stake in the Sacramento Kings. So there's also that kind of experience. And they also have stake in, and I know other sports teams in the Portland area. I think the Thorns, if I'm not mistaken. So I think what's important is that they have experience owning sports franchises, like what Kathy Engelbert says. They have the commitment to own a sports franchise. I mean, ultimately, we could talk about the growth of the WNBA all we want, but this was a league that not 5 years ago was unsure of where it stood and has been continuously struggling from a financial standpoint. So yes, there's growth there, but I think ultimately what the WNBA is looking for is an ownership group that's committed. So whether that be an NBA owned team or any sports team, I think is positive to them and will show that commitment.
Yeah, and finally, we've been kind of like dancing around that, like, yes, there's one spot now, but there might be more spots later. Do you think the W is, I think they're going to give this new media deal a couple years to settle in, but by the time we're adding this last team in 27, 28, that we're going to be looking at, now there are 3 or 4 more spots open.
Yeah, I mean, Cathy Engelbert has not said anything to that extent, right? She's continuously said it's 16 teams. They've added 2 more for 2026 in Portland and Toronto. And then they said 2027 would actually be the ideal for the 16th team. And then the deadliest deadline would be 2028. Personally, I wouldn't be shocked if they decided, hey, maybe we, depending on how the next year or so goes, hey, maybe we can bring in another team. But I honestly think that if I'm looking at the WNBA standpoint, the reason why they're not going out and saying it is probably because of being conservative about where the league had been just a couple of years ago. They kind of want to see it move along a little bit more, see what the next couple of years brings, see what this media rights deal really does, how the CBA shakes out. And maybe once those things happen is when they can decide, okay, maybe we can add another team. The perfect example is you look at the NBA, right? Just a couple of years ago, Adam Silver, or maybe just a year ago, Adam Silver was saying, we're going to fix our CBA first, and then we're going to talk about league expansion, right? And I think right now where the WNBA is probably looking at is we got our media rights deal, which the NBA already fixed. Then they had to fix their CBA, which the NBA already fixed as well. What's next? Looking at league expansion, and the WNBA is kind of doing those things at the same time. So in my head, they have these 4 slots open. Maybe they'll get a 5th or a 6th slot open, depending on what happens with the CBA negotiations and the growth over the next couple of years.
All right, Colin Salao, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Of course, Owen, always.
Time now for Front Office Sports Tomorrow, where we look ahead to what's coming in the business of sports. Female golfers are getting paid like never before. The LPGA announced on Wednesday that its 2025 season will have a total prize purse of $131 million over 33 tournaments. That's up $13 million from this year, $30 million from last year, $45 million from 2022, and $62 million from 2021. Golfers are feeling the rapid ascent in prize money this week at the CME Group Tour Championship, which is the final event on the LPGA's calendar and has the highest payout in the history of women's sports, with the winner receiving $4 million of the $11 million prize pool. That's it for today. If you're enjoying the show, let us know on X, Blue Sky, Threads, etc., and feel free to reach out to me on those platforms. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you tomorrow.